This 1923 photo of two women looks pleasant at first, but everything changes once you learn who they were. Rain tapped against the windows of Henderson's estate auctions in downtown Savannah as a Saturday sale carried on. David Martinez moved through the busy room with practiced focus, scanning tables covered with items from the Caldwell estate. He was a historian who specialized in African American history after the Civil War, and he had learned to spot value in things most people ignored. While other bidders crowded around the jewelry and furniture, David stayed in the quiet corners where old photos and papers were often overlooked. These forgotten pieces had shaped his career, helping him fill the gaps in a history that had rarely included black lives and experiences. In the far corner, under a water-stained portrait of Confederate officers, he found a wooden crate filled with photos, letters, and loose documents. The auction house had labeled it simply as Lot 247. David knelt and sorted through the box. Most of the photos showed white families posing stiffly in formal portraits or on vacations. Then he found something different. Inside an ornate silver frame was a larger photo of two black women standing in front of a grand Victorian mansion. Unlike most photos of black individuals from that era, they were positioned proudly and directly in front of the main entrance. Their clothing immediately stood out. Both wore elegant, expensive dresses with lace details, long skirts, and decorative brooches. Their hair was styled neatly, and they stood tall with calm, steady expressions. The woman on the left looked to be in her early 30s, slender with sharp features. The woman on the right appeared a little older, soft in the face, but just as composed. Their hands were folded the same way, as if the photographer had instructed them. David flipped the frame over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, Grace and Florence, Whitmore Estate, April 1904. The Whitmore family was well known in Savannah's history. They had been wealthy merchants who kept their fortune even after the Civil War. But David had never come across any mention of Grace or Florence in the records he had studied. The photograph itself was in excellent condition for something over a century old. The mansion behind the women was huge, with white wood siding, ornate trim, tall windows, and a wide porch supported by columns. Everything looked perfectly maintained. David realized that bidding for Lot 247 would start in 10 minutes. His research funds were limited, but something about this photo felt too important to ignore. When the lot was called, he was the only bidder. He bought the entire crate for $75. Back home, he cleared his table and unpacked the items. Rain still fell outside, but now it sounded peaceful. He set up his high-resolution scanner and carefully removed the photograph from its frame. The paper was high quality, the kind meant to last for generations. He scanned it at 2,400 dpi, then made coffee while the machine worked. A quick search confirmed that Thomas and Charlotte Whitmore had been key figures in Savannah society. They lived in the mansion until 1904. Then David saw something that stopped him mid-sip. According to a newspaper archive, Thomas and Charlotte Whitmore had both died on April 23, 1904, from suspected arsenic poisoning. The case had been considered suspicious, but no charges were ever filed. They had no children, and their family line ended with them. April 1904. The same date written on the back of the photo. The scanner beeped. David opened the file and zoomed in. The women's faces remained calm even under magnification, but their eyes held a focused, almost intense look. He zoomed in on their hands next. That was when he noticed the scars. The woman identified as Grace had deep, raised scars across her knuckles and wrists, partly hidden by the pose and the old camera quality. But with modern scanning, they were clear. He swallowed hard and looked closer at the background. He zoomed in on a ground floor window and adjusted the brightness. Inside, mostly hidden in the shadows, were metal bars. Not decorative ones. Real bars. On Monday morning, David went to the Georgia Historical Society. He requested everything they had on the Whitmore family and the couple's deaths. The archivist, Mrs. Patterson, brought him several boxes and microfilm reels. She said the case had always been considered one of Savannah's unsolved mysteries. She asked what his interest was. David explained that he had found a photo of two women who worked at the estate. She warned that records from that era rarely included detailed information about servants. David understood. This gap in the record was exactly why he took on projects like this. Newspaper articles from 1904 covered the Whitmore deaths in dramatic detail. The couple had fallen ill just hours after a dinner party at their home. Signs pointed to arsenic poisoning. Investigators first questioned the dinner guests, but none were sick. Attention then shifted to the household staff. The Whitmores employed two black women, Grace and Florence. No last names. Police searched for them, but both had disappeared, their rooms emptied. Authorities searched black neighborhoods, but found nothing. The paper soon published alarming headlines, accusing the two women of harming their employers. But as David read, he noticed what the articles failed to mention. There was no motive, no interviews with people who actually knew Grace or Florence. Nothing that explained their side of the story. Police files offer more details. Arsenic had been found in the roasted chicken served at dinner, and both women had worked in the kitchen that day. But there was also a note that Charlotte Whitmore had purchased arsenic 2 weeks earlier for killing rats. David photographed the file. At the back was a loose page, handwritten by Detective Morrison. Neighbors had reported hearing screams from the house. One woman claimed she had seen one of the two servants with injuries. The note suggested further investigation, but nothing indicated it had ever happened. For the next week, David searched for any trace of Grace and Florence in census records, church documents, and death certificates. Progress was slow. Their names appeared nowhere. Then he found something unexpected. At the First African Baptist Church, he discovered a collection of oral histories recorded in the 1970s. One interview stood out. It was with a woman named Esther Williams, who was 92 when the recording was made. She spoke about a story passed down from her grandmother. Esther said her grandmother had told her about two women named Grace and Florence who worked for a white family near Forsyth Park in the early 1900s. According to her, these women had been treated terribly. Esther said they weren't true employees. They were kept inside the home against their will, locked in at night, and hurt if they tried to leave. And because the family had money and influence, no one stepped in. One night, Esther said, the women did what they had to do to escape. After that, they vanished. Some people believe they went north. Others feared they didn't make it. Esther's grandmother always said the black community helped them, giving them shelter and new names so they could start over somewhere safe. David listened to the tape twice and wrote everything down. This was the first sign that Grace and Florence might have been victims, not criminals. But he needed stronger proof. He returned to the photograph. If these women had been locked in the house, this picture wasn't a normal portrait. It might have been staged to show outsiders that the women were treated well. That possibility made their calm expressions feel much heavier. Another lead came from Dr. Michelle Foster, a medical history expert at SCAD. She looked into old hospital files and found something important. At Candler Hospital, which had separate records for black patients, she located two entries from 1903 that matched the descriptions of Grace and Florence. Grace had been treated in January 1903 for broken ribs, severe bruising, and deep cuts on her back. The doctor wrote that her injuries didn't match her explanation and suspected abuse. Florence was treated in August for a broken wrist and burns on her hands and arms. The doctor again noted that her injuries didn't match her story and that she seemed very afraid. Both records listed the Whitmore address. This confirmed a pattern of harm that had gone unaddressed. The more David learned, the clearer it became that the system had failed him. He looked again at the scars in the photo, now knowing exactly what they meant. Grace and Florence had lived through at least 15 months of documented mistreatment, and probably longer. 3 days after the photograph was taken, the Whitmores were dead, and the two women were gone. David reached out to Dr. James Franklin, a retired professor who specialized in hidden support networks black communities formed after slavery. Dr. Franklin told him about what some historians call the Shadow Railroad, informal routes and safe houses that helped people escape dangerous situations even decades after slavery ended. He showed David an old journal kept by his great-grandfather, who had been a pastor at First African Baptist Church. The entries were coded, but one note from May 1904 caught David's attention. It mentioned two sisters in flight, G and F, who had been given new identities and safe passage north. Their new names were listed as Ruth and Naomi. Dr. Franklin explained that the pastor often used biblical names to protect people who needed new lives. If this entry referred to Grace and Florence, it meant they had survived. They had escaped, and people who understood their suffering had helped them. David photographed the journal page, realizing what it meant. Grace and Florence hadn't simply vanished. They had been moved out through a quiet network, given new identities, and sent somewhere far from Savannah where they could finally live safely. The community had protected them, choosing to support two women who defended themselves rather than hand them over to a system that had never protected black lives. Is there any way to learn what happened to them afterward? David asked. Dr. Franklin thought for a moment. It would be hard, he said. The point of new names was to make people untraceable. Still, he explained that there were common destinations at the time, large northern cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, or New York. These places had strong black communities, churches, and support groups that helped recent arrivals blend in and start fresh. He suggested David search for women named Ruth or Naomi in church records or early census listings from around 1904 or 1905. Women with no earlier paper trail. Women the right age. It's unlikely, Dr. Franklin said, but if these are the same women, and if their story is what it appears to be, it should be told. They weren't criminals. They were survivors who stood up against a system that tried to control them. David spent the next month digging through archives. He began with Philadelphia church records, since the city had been a major destination for black families moving north. Many churches kept detailed notes on new members, including when they arrived and where they came from. At Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in 1794, he finally found a lead. In the September 1904 membership book were two new names, Ruth Washington and Naomi Johnson. Both were in their early 30s. Both were listed as coming from the South. And both joined on the same day. David requested more material from the church. Ruth and Naomi had become active members, one working as a seamstress and the other as a hotel cook. They had lived in the same boarding house on Lombard Street in Philadelphia's black neighborhood. But the most important discovery came from a small collection of items donated after Ruth Washington's death in 1947. Her folder included letters, photographs, and a handwritten journal. David opened it carefully. The first entry, dated October 1904, read, "We are safe here. I still have nightmares, but we are safe. We have been given a chance to live as free women. I don't know when my mind will let go of that house, but every day away from it is a blessing." Later entries described Ruth's life in Philadelphia, her work, her friendships, and her church involvement. But throughout the journal were reminders of what she and Florence had lived through, always referred to as the house, and what we did escape. One journal entry from January 1905 revealed the truth. Ruth wrote that she and Florence had talked about their decision. Florence believed they would have died if they stayed, and Ruth agreed. She described the way Charlotte Whitmore looked at them, a look that convinced her they had no future in that house. Ruth explained that they used the arsenic Charlotte had purchased and mixed it into the food. She felt no guilt, only relief that they survived. David reread the passage. It was a direct confession, written years later by a woman, who finally felt safe enough to record what had happened. Other entries described the mistreatment they had faced. Ruth wrote about being beaten, locked in the basement without food, and forced to work long hours. She said Charlotte often created reasons to punish them, while Thomas warned he would accuse them of crimes if they tried to leave. A 1906 entry said they found hidden letters from other women who had been held in the basement before them. Ruth feared those women had never escaped. She also wrote about how she and Florence planned their escape, knowing running away alone would never work. They believed the only way to live was to make sure the Whitmores could never harm them again. They accepted they would never return to Savannah or use their real names, but they wanted a chance at life. After confirming Ruth was Grace, David traced her family. Ruth married Thomas Washington in 1912 and had 2 children, Dorothy and James. Dorothy later had 3 children, and one of them, Patricia, was still alive at 86. David arranged to meet her. Patricia remembered her grandmother as strong and private. She said Ruth never talked about her past and often struggled with nightmares and fear of closed spaces. When Patricia saw the old photograph, She recognized her immediately. David explained what he had learned. Patricia listened through tears, saying she had always sensed her grandmother carried a hidden story. David then worked with Dr. Rebecca Chun, a forensic photography expert. In her lab, they scanned the photo using advanced imaging tools. Dr. Chun found small dark marks on the women's sleeves. Enhanced scans showed there were old bloodstains that had been cleaned but not fully removed. They studied the windows in the background. Inside one room, enhanced images showed two collapsed figures on the floor. Plates of food sat on the table. The photo had been taken after the Whitmore's deaths. It was not a formal portrait at all. David noticed the low camera angle and the focus on the women, not the house. Someone close to them had taken it. Likely to document the truth, Dr. Chin zoomed in on Grace's hands and revealed a small glass bottle, the same type used for arsenic solutions. Through another window, a calendar showed the date April 23rd, 1904, the day the deaths occurred. David shared the findings with both families. They felt sadness, pride, and respect. The Georgia Historical Society added the photo to its permanent collection, pairing it with the full story. At the exhibit, Patricia and Andrea stood together, grateful that Grace and Florence's voices were finally being heard.